The story of the Szarrs doesn't start with Amanita Szarr, but she is the best path into their thick air, blood dark world. Like a lot of you watching this, Amanita started as a stranger to the world of Fae Rune's vampirism. She was raised in the Szarr country estate near a village known as Ang of Lead, meaning that the estate was likely and fittingly located in the Fields of the Dead. An ancient battleground turned into a flourishing agricultural realm, the bodies that fell in the fight are regularly turned up by ploughs, their rotting flesh having long since fertilised the soil. Amanita had visited the Szarr Palace and Baldur's Gate before, but she had never been allowed in the ballroom. All of her life was spent in this country estate, tended to by old family servants like old Drossel. I think of this small snow globe of Amanita's world being quite similar to the world of Gormenghast in the book Titus Grown, filled with dust and tradition and stagnation. Amanita calls the estate staff old family servants, among them someone called, as I mentioned before, old Drossel, just to hammer that point home. The name and Amanita's descriptors imply that the staff have served the Szarrs for decades, probably knowing of the vampiric heritage that awaited Amanita, possibly thralls themselves or at least devotees to their immortal masters, and well aware of the perils of displeasing them. Keeping the mortal Szarr away from Baldur's Gate is a smart move and a lesson learned from family history. Having the family split up means that the Szarr line can't be extinguished in one fell swoop via an attack either at Baldur's Gate or at the country estate without precise coordination, and the country estate is just far enough from Baldur's Gate to make that quite a difficult ordeal. And so for years Amanita Szarr was safe in the country estate, not knowing what awaited her when she would eventually be allowed in that mysterious ballroom. At 13 years old, Amanita was summoned to the Szarr Palace. She did not know her family were vampires, but may have suspected that Cazador was her uncle in name only. As I'll explain in a later section, the Szarr family seems to have been comprised of blood relations and master vampires who chose their spawn from Baldur's Gate, meaning that there's no certainty that Amanita Szarr was related to Cazador genetically, though unfortunately she would be linked to him by blood soon enough. Arriving into Baldur's Gate in the family's best carriage through the north-facing Black Dragon Gate, Amanita was carried to the Szarr Palace in a litter. This was doubtless a way for the Szarrs to flex that they had enough money to carry someone on a litter through the upper city right to the palace, and people would have known that this was probably a Szarr inheritor coming to see the palace for the first time. Amanita remembers thinking that the palace was chilling. She wanted to go back home to the country. But she would never see that country estate again. For the first time in her life, she was ushered into the Szarr ballroom. Waiting for her was the whole family. Uncle Cazador, Grandam Fistula, Great-Aunt Dralia, and Cousin Blovart. Amanita makes the point to describe these figures as every living Szarr, making for a remarkably small family of just 5. Vampires aren't very good at getting along with each other, but nevertheless this vampire coven feels especially small. I don't know what happened to Amanita's parents or the wider family of aunts and uncles and cousins you assume that she would have, but it could be that being raised as the only child in an isolated country estate by herself, by incredibly old family servants, was just the norm for Amanita, and she didn't really think much of it. She may not have known any different, although to us this appears really strange. The same gilded clavichord that Tav would encounter a century later was playing as Amanita entered the ballroom, though no one was sitting at its keys. The Szarrs faced the young teenager, sitting in a semicircle around her. Cazador beckoned her closer to look him in the eye. Amanita, having no idea what was coming, obliged. And then Cazador sunk his teeth into Amanita's neck, turning her into the next Szarr vampire. Unlike with his future spawn, there was another extra step here, some kind of ritual called the family rites. I think this was a ritual where Amanita would then drink some of Cazador's blood, which would elevate her power to being above that of a vampire spawn, while still maintaining that she didn't become a master vampire like Cazador, therefore putting her on equal footing with the other members of the Szarr family. Amanita, though, had a mind of her own. She was horrified by what had just happened and refused to endure the family rites. even though she was already suffering from the hunger, a pain that can be only satiated by blood. Cazador commanded cousin Blovart to imprison Amanita in the attic. As there's no grand in his name, cousin Blovart was probably the second youngest Szarr next to Amanita, thus used as the family's muscle by his uncle. Inside the attic, Amanita was kept company by coffins, a torture rack, torture tools, cobwebs, and weak rays of sunlight, which now burned her. In captivity, carefully timed for the moment when she was at her weakest, she eventually drank some human blood that Cazador had sent up to her. In punishment for her refusal of taking the family rights, Cazador didn't send up any other sustenance for a whole year. Only once she was destroying the walls in frustration would he send something up. Not a bottle of blood this time, but a bound, alive captive. Cazador forced Amanita to kill and drink the blood of this captive. Her hands were now bloody in both ways. Now she was a full vampire, against her own will. In the attic, she cursed her family name and stopped going by Amanita. Instead, Lady Incognita was born, in self-imposed exile in the Szarr Palace attic. We know about how Amanita died and became Lady Incognita because Lady Incognita committed her history to paper, but this was only years after it had passed. Although the months are listed in this brief autobiography of hers, they all have the same year of 1477. Her transformation doesn't line up with this chronology, as the year would have to advance to 1478 to account for the year that she was spent confined in the attic after being turned. So these accounts were almost definitely written in hindsight in the year of 1477, with Incognita being born 1 century, 2, 3 or 4 before 1477, all the way back to, at the most, 1263, 13 years before Cazador became the patriarch and master vampire of the Szarr family. Incognita spent her immortal years burying herself in books and scrolls and ancient tomes. She documented the history of her family and studied vampire physiology, refusing to partake in Szarr's hedonistic lifestyle. There's no sign that I could find that she ever left the attic. Her living quarters, if you can even call it that, is up the ladder in a small corner of the attic. In a chest next to her beat-up bed are remnants of her past, a hand drum, perhaps from her childhood, and a sapphire to hold up against the sunlight. Faerun folk belief holds that kissing a sapphire helps you keep any secret, no matter how grave the sin. Incognita must have had a fair few secrets to keep, this gem her only confidant. In the same chest is a scroll of Dominate Person, insurance against any unwanted intruders in her attic, and there's also a pouch with the key to the ballroom hatch. Incognita had the freedom to come and go from the attic, but she chose not to. That same hatch is locked when Tav finds it in 1492. Next to her bed is a bottle of common table wine, a far cry from the expensive vintages and brandies in the wings below. She has 2 brooms and 2 bars of soap, eager to keep herself and her living area as clean as possible, to atone for the filth coursing through her veins. The idea of Incognita obsessively cleaning herself is one that I think matches what we know of her so far. There are also lit candles which Tav finds close to her bed, so Incognita must be near, just veiled from sight, otherwise you would assume that these candles would be long since burned out if no one was in the attic to keep them burning. Signs point to a cut quest where Incognita would have helped Tav infiltrate Cazador's living quarters, maybe using a person infected with red thrombosis or Thandel's paroxysm to drug his vampire spawn. Because Incognita, as well as documenting the history of the Szarrs, was also researching how illnesses of the blood affected vampires. In her treatise Diseases of the Blood, Incognita researches how different types of infected blood could render a vampire temporarily vulnerable with the corresponding illness. Quote, "The bulk of the text is descriptions of symptoms and diagnoses of red thrombosis and Thandel's paroxysm. Lady Incognita notes that, with a vampire's superior senses, it's possible to train oneself to recognise infected prey by scent before biting them, red thrombosis by a piquant, gingery odour, and the paroxysm by a sharp astringency. The vampire-spawned Deliria and Incognita would have had interests in common had they ever joined forces." I don't know whether Cazador ever read her research on diseases of the blood. Incognita, though, doubtless was taking the harm reduction approach for for vampirism, doing what little harm she could and distancing herself from culpability as much as possible. Incognita may have found an unlikely ally in Raphael. Multiple copies of her work are found in the House of Hope archives, where records of Raphael's projects are kept. Raphael was researching vampirism by the looks of it, and for this, Incognita's work is surely indispensable. As Mephistopheles is Raphael's father, his red-skinned son may have been seeking a way to get Cazador's souls for himself, or to pervert the rite of profane ascension to piss off his father. Breezing past that now, but I will return to that in depth later on. Outside of Incognita's attic, what was life like for a vampire in Baldur's Gate? Astarian's Book of Hungers gives us plenty of details about living as a vampire in Baldur's Gate. A quick aside here, this video is not going to touch on Astarian much, if at all. He is a complicated, beloved character, and that eponymous book of his is coming out soon, written by the horror author T.J. Kingfisher, whose books are glaring at me from my TBR as we speak. Her book will have a flood of new information about Astarian's life and Cazador, so I'll probably have to release an updated video on Cazador once it's out. Don't fret though, a video on Astarian is coming, as well as all the other origin characters, but those videos take a lot of time and care as I want to get them right, and I know that hundreds and thousands of people are very invested in me getting them right, so basically, I don't want to mess it up. Moving on. Like grapes from different regions, blood from different veins has a certain palate. Those who live in the outer city have had a hard life, meaning strong, earthy blood. Upper city veins shed blood aged by a rich diet and luxurious rest, and in the lower city there's a cavalcade of different blood to choose from. Salty sailors, spiced merchants, plonk beggars that, although of a lower quality, as beggars lack regular nutrition, are widely available and rarely missed. Hunting grounds abound in a city like Baldur's Gate, and favoured ones for Cazador's spawn include Flygo's Flophouse, the Blushing Mermaid, and Rat's Run, a tavern not featured in the game, but outlined as a regular vampire haunt in the Book of Hungers. Easier hunts can be found in areas where people are either drunk or distracted, or transitory. A mother not returning to her loving home is going to raise way more alarm bells than a guest of Flygo's Flophouse who disappeared and skipped out on their bill. Then there are people like Lorna. Lorna is a woman looking for a half-decent date at the Blushing Mermaid, and there she ended up meeting a vampire. She was then romanced into attending an underground party at a place that this vampire only called the Palace. Her date pushed his food around his plate and brought his own metallic-smelling wine with him, but seemed eager and particularly interested in her clavicles. He wanted to introduce Lorna to his closest friends, a sign of a great date, right? No, of course he was a vampire. This is how vampires ensnare people. They seduce, romance, flirt, or otherwise sway people into going to a second location, and there they're tapped like a barrel. And this is your courteous reminder to never go to a second location with a stranger, even if your date has been going really well. It's not worth the risk, please don't do it. At least, re-tapping them like a barrel, that's what Cazador's spawn thinks is happening to their victims. Some victims aren't missed, some are noticed and reported to the Flaming Fist, and some have squads of mercenaries or guards or staff sent after them if they don't return home. These victims are scions of patriarchs, noble families who rule Baldur's Gate through wealth, influence, ancestry, and any combination thereof. Vampires do have to be careful who they target. Szarr's Chamberlain, Antoine Dufay, warned Spawn in the palace's blood donor ledger not to take upper-class citizens, especially those from patriarch families. Patriarchs have the power to turn the entire city upside down to find their missing relations, meaning Cazador has to smooth over their concerns or manipulate others to do so to make sure that nothing that's led back to him gets uncovered. Because if one patriarch family lets another patriarch family know that they let the disappearance of one of their own slide, all hell would break loose for those power-hungry piranhas. Some patriarchs, though, definitely know about Cazador's Cazador's proclivities. As long as he doesn't encroach on their territory and sticks to the lower city though, they don't really care. The upper city turns a blind eye to vampires, corruption, law enforcement's brutality, much like real life, murder, theft and a whole lot, as long as it doesn't interfere with their family or interests. And then there are those who don't turn a blind eye to Cazador's activities, but that's only because they want to become a vampire themselves. These people are called devotees or familiars. You may know them better as thralls from Skyrim or Vampire the Masquerade, or donors/suppliers. In wider Faerun, devotees are kept in vampire dens or have a special relationship with one vampire who they supply. They may have done so because they were charmed or in exchange for the promise of being turned one day. These willing blood bags can be found throughout the Szarr Palace. Siren, Greenfirm, Wilhelm and other staff are unturned, having appeared at the palace doors begging Cazador to give them his eternal gift. Over time, they're brainwashed and turned into menial, unpaid labour blood bags, though Cazador still doesn't permit his spawn from drinking them, as they do count as living creatures. High atop the hills of Baldur's Gate, there is a patriarch palace which Baldur and Tav calls a Gothic monstrosity. This, however, is not the original Szarr homestead. The first time the Szarrs tried to get a footing in Baldur's Gate, they were burnt out, quite literally, because the first house of the Szarrs was in Tumbledown. Tumbledown is a perpetually foggy neighbourhood where in modern times one can find the cliffside cemetery. Overlooking the Keonthar River, it's the final resting place of thousands of Baldurans. Centuries before Cazador and before the Outer City had even been established, the Szarrs were merchants and farmers. They owned a substantial portion of Tumbledown, which they looked over from their imposing mansion. Their land was solely the resting place of Szarrs back then, and it was only later that it became a widely used cemetery. I don't have many details about what the Szarrs were up to in this mansion exactly, as murder in Baldur's Gate stops short of explaining quite that much, but something they did pissed off a rival family enough for them to attempt mass murder. On one frosty night when the mist was heavy, this rival family crept into the Szarr mansion and murdered the Szarrs in their beds, looting and setting fire to their surroundings as they left. Ghosts of the murdered Szarr family haunt the mansion's ruins even now, sometimes descending into the streets of Tumbledown to abduct ordinary folk and take them God knows where. I don't think Szarr ghosts are stealing folk away. I don't even think it was a rival family who murdered them in their beds. I think the Szarr's vampiric nature was known back then, and it was either a gur or a group of vampire hunters who broke into their mansion, murdered the vampires, and then burnt the abode to the ground as a final bit of insurance against any Szarr vampire surviving. But some did. Those remaining Szarr vampires are the ones who steal folk away in Tumbledown, taking them back to the mausoleums near their ruined mansion to drink deep. Ironically, the rumours of a haunted Szarr mansion does make it the perfect vampire lair. Unable to convince anyone to rebuild the mansion and move in, the city turned the Szarr estate into a cemetery. A crew named the Gravemakers work in the cemetery to put down ghouls, zombies and other undead who have the habit of rising up from the graves. Their base of operations is the half-burnt-out Szarr mansion in the cemetery centre, and some say that the ghosts of the Szarrs prey on the Gravemakers, while others say that the spectres help them in their duty. Decades before the events of Baldur's Gate 3, where Duke Ulder Ravengard was one of the 4 ruling dukes, the parts of the cliffside cemetery nearest said cliff had collapsed into the river below. The erosion rendered the crypts and mausoleums deep in the earth visible from the river, like looking in on an ant farm. Strange red and green lights have been seen in those exposed chambers beneath the burnt-out mansion. What are these lights? I'm definitely getting off track here, but please indulge me. Back when fog rolled through Baldur's Gate before Umberlee banished it, more about that in my Umberlee video, shops lit green glass lanterns above their doors to indicate they were open, the green light of which remained visible through the thick fog. I think the same thing is happening underneath the Szarr mansion. I think there are green and red lanterns above abodes in the sprawling catacombs in the cliffside cemetery, so that denizens can see which establishments are open in the dim tunnels. Either that, or these are thieves' guilds' lanterns signalling to someone by the river. Modern times have the Szarrs operate out of the Szarr Palace in the upper city. Here Cazador regularly entertains high society to keep him in their good graces, though as such the palace is too public for the ritual he's performing in Baldur's Gate 3. To have a palace right in the centre of Baldur's Gate indicates that the Szarrs have been an unbroken part of Baldur's Gate history since the beginning of the Old Wall. This alone is good for boasting and battling patriarch's hierarchy in high society, where oldest equals best because you can't buy history. Though in Baldur's Gate, with enough money you can fudge it a bit. Money is crude. Blood is everything, especially for the Szarrs. Signs that the Szarr palace on the ramparts is less hospitable to visitors come on quite early. Rusty weapons are piled up in the guard tower, there's a jar of blood found in a stray barrel, and there are manacles on the gatehouse desk. Not a particularly welcoming ambience. A discarded, hidden, empty pouch on the ramparts also hints that someone might have tried to escape from the palace. Once. The smell emanating from the doors suggests why. A strange, metallic, organic smell wafting from the halls within. Ordinary citizens might not know what the smell is exactly, but nevertheless it awakens an ancient instinct to flee and makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up straight. From the outside, there's no way to see in and figure out why the wealthy patriarch's halls reek. Blackout curtains are hung on every single window, blocking any prying eyes. When you do make it through the doors, stepping foot within the Szarr palace is to be assaulted with decadence, even if it is slightly stale and old-fashioned. The walls are painted a deep crimson, hanged with paintings, long draping curtains hide doors from sight, and towering high ceilings make one feel small and insignificant. Beautifully carved furniture adorns each room, with bottles of Starburst shandy everywhere. Starburst shandy is made with angel wings, if the description's to be believed. If that's true, it's a flex that Cazador can afford so many bottles of it. And if they're false, then that's plenty of cheap alcohol to dull the instincts of any houseguest. Potions aplenty are sealed away in cupboards too. Some for cleaning, others for vigour, the cleaning type being supplied by the Bone Cloak Apothecary run by Dereth Bonecloak, who's foraging in the Underdark for mushrooms in Act 1. Specifically, the Bone Cloaks provide an alchemical bloodstain remover, and lots of it. You have to wonder whether they suspected how vast quantities of bloodstain remover was being used at the Szarr Palace, and why they needed to restock quite so often. I suspect that Dereth knows very well what goes on behind those doors, and thinks it wiser to continue being useful to Cazador Szarr than to stick their necks out and get bit. The same Provender ledger that lists the complicity of the Bone Cloaks also indicates that Baldur's Mouth broadsheets are regularly delivered to the estate. Cazador keeps up with the latest city gossip, news and political manoeuvres, as well as ascertaining which way the masses are being ushered by the editor of Baldur's Mouth, Etvard Needle. Etvard's pen can be weighted by thoughtful donations. Gortash in particular just loves to donate to a free press, which the Szarrs may have done from time to keep a story out of the paper or make sure a story stays in. Although the present is present in the newspapers, Cazador cares about the past too. He keeps intriguing reminders of his species' history around the palace. Vampires this time, not the Szarrs. There is a bust of Mordoc Salanmer in the Chamberlain's wing. Mordoc is known as the Pale Knight and King of Vampires. He turned the population of Baldur's Gate into undead from his Onyx Tower, and in the chaos his own vampire spawn turned citizens into spawn themselves to strengthen their master's forces. Mordoc is one of the most formidable vampires to ever exist, and vampires since referred to him as the Pale Knight in reverence. For Cazador to have his bust indicates to me that Mordoc is who Cazador aims to emulate and surpass. Mordoc reached heights other vampires envied, yet to be a vampire ascendant is to be even stronger than the king of vampires. In the palace office is a bust of Shiressa Runemaster, another of history's formidable vampire elders. Shiressa slew the vampire that created her, just like Cazador did. Like Cazador, she enjoyed playing cat and mouse games with her victims, and she was ambitious. She eventually became a Runemaster, one of the heads of a secret lich society that controlled Kalimshan and neighbouring nations from the shadows. Once again, another inspiration for Cazador. The centrepiece of the palace is the ballroom, the apex of Szarr's hedonistic parties, where unlucky guests would be drunk at the end of the night, once the nobles had left. The doors to the ballroom are usually always open, a reminder for Cazador's spawn of the fates of those they lure back to the palace, spreading its rotten ambience throughout the wings. Once the doors are closed, you can see these ornate rat engravings. Why rats? Why not bats, although that would be on the nose, or some kind of majestic creature to symbolise the Szarr family? I think the rats symbolise not the Szarrs, but those they prey on. They see mortals as rats, vermin, dehumanised, and available aplenty in Baldur's Gate. The circles of rats on the door also reminds me of a rat king, the urban legend that rats get tangled up by their tails and become a writhing mass. Something tells me that's how the Szarrs see their hordes of victims. Below the ballroom are the dormitories for the Szarr spawn, favoured or not, with the especially unfavoured sent to the kennel to be tormented by Godi. I wager that's the destined location of the leather straps with buckles, balms and oils ordered in the ledger. Perfect for restraining both the victims and spawn, and healing the latter's Godi-inflicted injuries so they can go back on the hunt. Even deeper below the kennels, the ballroom and Incognita's attics, are the Tourmaline Depths. The Szarr Palace is built on top of the Tourmaline Depths, marked out as property of the Szarr family by Donella Szarr, the architect. Incognita wrote of the Tourmaline Depths in the self-same titled book, writing, "It was Master Vampire Donella Szarr who reopened the vast blue-green holes beneath Baldur's Gate and brought them under our control. But what is the history of this subterranean expanse, and how far back does it go?" Not even Donella the architect knew for certain, but in her notebook she speculated that the depths were originally dwarven built by exiles from Berendon, though she admitted she was no scholar of dwarven history. Though deeply delved, the halls were certainly more of an outpost than a city, Donella wrote, though if it was established as a facility over a mine, what were the dwarves mining here? A larger question in this writer's mind is, how did these abandoned depths go undiscovered for so long under a great city like Baldur's Gate? Were they deliberately hidden by some kind of persistent glamour that finally wore off? We may never know. In the Tourmaline Depths, Donella uncovered the defiled chapel, where Cazador would host his rite of profane ascension. Behind, in the chapel workshop, he appears to have been burning goblins for fuel. And right at the very bottom of the Tourmaline Depths is a buried rosewood casket, trapped to protect its contents. A Pelor Sun blade, formidable against the undead, courtesy of a blessing from the god of sun, Pelor himself. Being buried underground in a casket in a vampire's lair is the ultimate middle finger to the sun god. The Szarrs are as petty as they are cruel. I'm halfway through telling you all about the Szarr family, so if you've stuck around for this long, please do consider subscribing and liking this video. I appreciate every single last one of you, and if you want to, you can also subscribe to my Patreon. For £5 a month, you get early access to videos and ad-free access to videos, and you'd be helping me out massively as this is my full-time pursuit. Okay, back to the Szarrs. For the Szarr family, the normal rules don't apply when it comes to their family tree. As indicated by Incognita saying her family was only 5 people strong when she was summoned to Baldur's Gate, it's not the usual branches of cousins, aunts, uncles, brothers, sisters, siblings, and even parents. Instead, I think the Szarr family is a series of vampires siring their children through turning noteworthy strangers into vampires. Otherwise, wouldn't their line be far thicker by the 13th to 14th century when Incognita was turned, and therefore more people at her turning? This theory is supported by the names of the Szarr master vampires changing in style, with some sounding like they originally came from regions far further afield than Baldur's Gate. Incognita lists her ancestors as our illustrious predecessors, which feels like sarcasm, considering how much she despises the Szarr name, but she also notes that her list is about the succession of master vampires in Baldur's Gate. Generations in the Szarr family aren't begun by waves of children being born, but by one master vampire taking over from their sire, whether through violence of their own making, violence from some other stray factor, or just pure luck. The Szarr master vampires from the year 612 Dale Reckoning are as follows, along with their tenure as master vampire. 612 to 698, Erevask the Forebear, 86 years. 698 to 713, Zoltan Far the Eviscerator, 15 years. 713 to 888, Madame Talon the Well-Preserved, 175 years. 888 to 955, the Interregnum, Temporary Suppression by Lathandarians, 67 years. 955 to 998, Blazous the Cory Fee, who led her spawn in ecstatic blood dances, 43 years. 998 to 1019, Dixon Nightbender, 21 years. 1019 to 1019, Fabler the Fleeting, 1 year. 1019 to 1138, Hideous Gathwick, who knew not satiety, 119 years. 1138 to 1204, Donella Szarr the Architect, who opened the Tourmaline Depths, 66 years. 1204 to 1276, Velioth the Martinet, 72 years. 1276 to the present, Cazador Szarr the Avid, 216 years. That is, if we assume this list was written in 1492 DR. 201 years if it was written in 4077 DR. Starting with Erevask the Forebear, the Szarrs have been Baldur's Gate master vampire since Baldur disappeared to the present age. Madame Talon the Well-Preserved ruled for the longest, next to Cazador, and it looks like master vampires rule for anything from 1 year to 216, but under a century is the most common tenure. I guess that's how long it takes for their successor to tire of being ordered around. I reckon the Szarrs, Cazador especially, to be the most grateful for Donella, or at least as grateful as vampires can get. Donella uncovered the Tourmaline Depths, though she couldn't figure out what the outpost she discovered was meant to be mining in the first place. Incognita wonders how they remain undiscovered for so long, and me too, as the structures can be seen in partial form in the sewers underneath Baldur's Gate, so you'd think they would have been unearthed when the sewers were dug, but apparently not. Incognita's study on the depths is yet another one of her books that's owned by Raphael and that can be found in his House of Hope. He's either Incognita's biggest fan or Incognita and he are working on something together. Books aside from Incognita's have been written about the Szarrs, but Tav doesn't have access to these. Gale confesses that he's read the histories about Cazador Szarr and his family, and these histories are unflattering, as Gale calls Cazador a nasty fellow. Further, Dev notes describe the existence of the Szarr Coven. We never meet any other Szarr vampire apart from Cazador himself, but in earlier Starian dialogue he says he's kept by the Szarr family. He's never been able to resist their commands and they won't control him anymore. To me this sounds like Astarion can be controlled by the other Szarrs, no doubt evidence of the scrapped questline including Incognita and the other members of the Szarr Coven. It was Velioth the Martinet who sired Cazador. His suffix, Martinet, indicates that he had strict rules his spawn must follow, which fits in with what we know about Velioth. Velioth took it upon himself to teach Cazador his rules of vampiric existence, or that's the excuse Velioth used to torment Cazador for decades. Velioth's lessons were as follows.
Velioth's first lesson is always to dominate. Allow none to be your equal. Velioth recalls when Cazador reached out to a former friend. His punishment was to watch as Velioth drained his friend dry. Velioth's second lesson is that power comes from solitude. To share with others is to be weak, and to be weak is to fail and die. Velioth recalls when Cazador rebelled against him. Cazador suffered 11 years of impalement because he failed. Velioth's third lesson is to act not in haste. A near immortal has time to plan, time to act only when others will pay the price of action. Velioth recalls Cazador, his lessons learned, killing him in the rite of perfect slaughter. How they both laughed. Velioth recalls Cazador boiling the flesh from his skull, and then, to mock him, clamping his schooling scroll in Velioth's jaws.
At some point, Velioth found Cazador and welcomed him into the Szarr family. Cazador may hail from Kara-Tur, and more specifically, the island known as Kozakura. This ancient language is used to navigate the Szarr palace, but it has also been carved into the Szarr family ring, so Szarr usage of Kozakuran may predate even Cazador himself. I do have some clues to go on about where Cazador was born. From the description of the Rhapsody dagger, which reads, Cazador's love of poetry arose after he read one on the naked stomach of a dead child in his homeland. The child was hung from the lowest branch of a tree. Cazador read the poem and looked at the child and knew that this was the art form for him. So from that, I know that a war probably took place in his childhood, hence the atrocities committed against the innocent. At least I hope that was the reasoning. If he is from Kara-Tur, this would roughly coincide with the Tennu War, which spanned from 1034 DR to 1045 DR. Assuming Cazador arrived in Baldur's Gate prior to 1276 DR, and at the very, very least prior to 1265 to account for the 11 years of impalement he suffered at Velioth's hands, this does seem to line up. Conservative estimates of his arrival in Baldur's Gate can be put at around 1200 to 1206 to account for Velioth becoming Master Vampire, finding Cazador and then turning him into his vampire spawn. Using this date, I think that Cazador may have grown up in Kozakura between 1000 to 1100 DR, which would put him right in the middle of the Tennu War. There's one other potential clue about Cazador's childhood in the description for the heavy crossbow called the Long Arm of the Gur, found in the Szarr family vault. When the boy was 7, he was frightened badly by a vampire spawn during a public burning. Seized by the flames, the creature didn't shrivel up. It swelled and burst like a squeezed leech. Brains splattered the boy's shoes, grey-pink and pulpy. He would never forget it. But this crossbow might have been in the Szarr family centuries before Cazador's birth, a trophy from Gur who were sent to kill them. Or Cazador is from one of the other nations in Faerun, but with so few clues about his elven life, that sample size is too wide for me even to begin to tackle. Kozakuran may simply be a language used by the first Szarr Master Vampire, Erevask the Forebear, and has been adopted since then by the family as their default language. After being under Velioth's wing for so long, Cazador finally killed Velioth in a rite of perfect slaughter while they both laughed. There's no clear explanation of what the rite of perfect slaughter consists of in D&D canon as far as I can find, but it must be a way to kill your vampire sire completely and become a master vampire yourself. Velioth is gleeful that Cazador finally managed to kill him, laughing at the absurdity of him being happy that Cazador finally got the better of him, while Cazador laughs out of relief to see Velioth dead and escape him at last, giddy with the power that he now wields. Cazador continues to torment Velioth even after his death. Vestiges of Velioth have been trapped in crystal vases in his dungeon, and they can be heard whispering from the crystal. His soul was also turned into ink and written onto parchment, trapping him in the paper prison for centuries. Fittingly, this parchment is named Eternal Cruelty, though we could debate for an age about whether it's truly cruelty to avenge yourself upon your abuser. As one final insult to his master, Cazador uses Velioth's skull as an ornament to hold the Scroll of Black Mass, which contains the instructions Cazador got from Mephistopheles about how to become a vampire ascendant and surpass Velioth forever, preventing any vampire from inheriting the title of Szarr Master Vampire. Velioth's cycle of abuse continues with Cazador. Cazador abuses his spawn because he's a sadist, but also because if he treats them any differently than he was treated, then that means he could have been treated differently, and his unlife didn't have to be traumatic. Taking his pain and fury out on weaker beings makes him feel powerful, but not powerful enough that he's confident he can overcome any peer. If Cazador dares to raise any of his spawn to full vampirehood, they can move against him and challenge his leadership of the Szarrs. Cazador isn't confident enough in his abilities or his power to let this happen. Cazador would become the longest ruling master vampire of the Szarr clan. He's lived in Baldur's Gate as a master vampire for at least 200 years, though as he still looks like an elf, barring the red eyes which can be easily hidden or laughed off, this can be excused by curious patriarchs and ordinary folk as a normal elven lifespan. On the outside, Cazador Szarr is a powerful patriarch, a respected man known to host lavish, hedonistic banquets at his palace. To the public, Cazador is an ordinary, if reclusive, noble. On the inside, once the doors to the Szarr palace have been firmly closed against the sunlight, Cazador is a vampire infernalist. Vampire infernalists have entered into a contract with Mephistopheles and are arrogant, territorial creatures who rarely share their cities with any other vampire infernalists. Vampires think entering a pact with a devil exploits a loophole in infernal contracts. Vampires are immortal, so they'll never have to go to the hells and become a lemure. Right? But devils obviously have ways to outsmart immortals, and vampires don't like to dwell on what happens to them if someone happens to stake them through their heart. The rats in the rampart guards tower and the bats in the ballroom are evidence of Cazador's infernalist nature. One of the infernalist lair region effects is that animals in the vampire's domain serve the vampire's will. From dusk until dawn, medium or smaller beasts have the charmed condition within 1 mile of the lair. Although this is only from dusk until dawn, this is my headcanon for why these animals fight for Cazador. Other Balduran vampires, aside from the Szarr family, have clashed with Cazador, namely a vampire nightbringer named Celia. I don't have any more information about her, but God, I wish I did. As per the Book of Hungers, Cazador worships Mephistopheles. In exchange for the Black Mass scroll that details how to conduct a successful rite of ascension, Cazador is contracted to deliver 7,000 souls to Mephistopheles. Then he will ascend and be able to walk in the sun, suffer not from hunger, and grow his power beyond anything he imagined. The rub is that every single one of these 7,000 souls has to be alive at the time of the ritual. So Cazador enacted a cruel, inhumane plan. Upon his spawn bringing victims to Cazador, he didn't drink them dry as Astarion thought. Cazador turned every victim into vampire spawn, gave them the hunger, and then imprisoned them below the Szarr palace in the dungeon. Then he wrote their name on a list that he kept in his bedroom to keep meticulous track of the progress of his deal with Mephistopheles. One of his victims was Dawson Kiltmaker, who wasn't imprisoned in the normal crowded cages suspended from the ceiling. Instead, Cazador put him in a trapped puzzle area to see what he would do, purely for his own entertainment. Dawson confessed his sins in a notebook, hoping that it would ease his mind somewhat. Some of them were pretty bad. This guy used to torture animals. Above ground, Cazador had strict rules, just like his hated master Velioth, once again confirming that the cycle of abuse is in full swing. He taught each of his spawn the following. First, thou shalt not drink the blood of thinking creatures. Second, thou shalt obey me in all things. Third, thou shalt not leave my side unless directed. For thou shalt know that thou art mine. To transgress, sentenced spawn to be sent to the kennel and be tormented by Godi, who, having no flesh or blood himself, was immune to most vampire attacks. Other visitors to the Szarr palace included harvester devils and speaker devils, both sent by Mephistopheles. Harvester devils write contracts for poor mortals who signed their souls away, and serve to check the list of names against the souls in the dungeon to verify how far along Cazador is in his contract. Speaker devils are 4 armed devils hungry for secrets, who record anything they uncover in Mephistopheles' library in Mephistar, and have been provided to Cazador through Mephistopheles himself. These act as muscle for his most demanding missions. Cazador's power over his spawn comes from his position as their sire, and also his staff Woe, which stores the souls of all of those imprisoned in the palace. He never sets it down. To hear Woe coming from afar sparked terror for everyone in Cazador's palace. It signalled an approaching storm, and all his spawn could do was shrink into the shadows and hope his wrath didn't fall upon them. Cazador's power was unfettered. He ordered his spawn to submit to torture, or to torture themselves. When Astarion or any other spawn brought their victims to the palace, Cazador would ask them if they wanted to dine with him. If they accepted, he'd serve them with a putrid, rotten rat, and if they refused, he'd have them flayed. His journal records the minute details of every aspect of his spawn's lives, every order, failure, punishment, with zero emotion in the cold facts that he writes down. He pays special attention to Astarion. If Astarion dies on his adventures with Tav, Cazador writes, "What remains of Astarion has been found, discarded far from the city. I know not what sorry fate befell him, but he surely brought it on himself. His cadaver is being returned here with haste, and when it arrives I will drag whatever is left of his soul back into that putrid receptacle so he can finally take his place and the rite can begin." Reprehensible. Cazador lied to his spawn too about the rite of ascension. He told them that they too would ascend with him. He got them invested in his success, knowing that it would keep them hesitant about fleeing, and knowing that the look on their faces when he ascended and they remained spawn would be sweeter than any wine. He deliberately and gleefully gave them false hope. The Master Vampire of Baldur's Gate doesn't interact with other vampires much, but he is keeping up a correspondence with Mrel Alchem in Athkatla. Mrel is far enough away that they're not a direct competitor yet. Cazador gloats to them about his upcoming ascension after reminding Mrel that expanding their coven in Athkatla is easier as they face fewer challenges from other factions and law enforcement. Also known as the City of Coin, money rules everything in Athkatla. Activities and wares that would be illegal in other realms are permitted within the city walls, which Cazador implies makes it easier to abduct and turn people into vampires. And honestly, he's probably right. Utter power over Baldur's Gate is Cazador's ultimate goal. Any Gur that hunt him within its walls are killed and then turned into undead thralls to protect him from any harm, just as a final insult. Cazador is obsessed with learning about the city's power structures so he can manipulate and profit from them while avoiding any interference or competition. He notes down his thoughts in a journal titled The Power Structure of Baldur's Gate, where his notes track, quote, "The old problem of Nine Fingers and the Guild and new concerns about the ambitious young Lord Gortash. Cazador's worries about the Guild revolve around the rise of the brash new criminal kingpin known as the Stone Man, and what it might mean for the Gate's underworld if Nine Fingers is replaced. Meanwhile, the upstart Gortash is fielding prototypes of his steel watchers in the city streets. Are they capable enough to detect and damage Cazador's vampire spawn?" Alongside this journal are books on the Thieves Guild, who are harder to arrange meetings with courtesy of their secrecy. The vampire infernalist appears fascinated by Nine Fingers in particular, and how she maintains control despite so many vying for her throne. Cazador collects information like a magpie collects trinkets. He entertains counting house staff at his soirees, as well as politicians, heads of factions, minor nobles and flaming fist officers. By mingling them, he finds out who controls what, senior staff at the counting house, information about their occupations, what they think of the city's power structures, any weaknesses they might know of. In other words, everything he aspired to control. As Astarion puts it, Cazador hoarded details of who pulls every string in Baldur's Gate, just what a powerful vampire needs to make the city his puppet. If he'd ascended, the city would have been his in a 10-day. Guilds, nobles, politicians. If he controlled even a fraction of these, the city could be his and no one would ever know. His approach to power can be summed up in the words of Sun Tzu: "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 1,000 battles. Information is power." If Tav reads his thoughts after he uses Misty Escape to flee to his resting place in the final confrontation, you can hear his true thoughts about his vampirism.
"These deathless dreams hold memories of a mortal life once forgotten. Of the boy I was, the man I became, the monster that will not end. I sleep but cannot rest. I live but cannot die. I am eternal, and I grieve."
Oh, cry me a river. It's almost a small consolation that this picked scab of a person was miserable for his entire life. Cazador's last words are
"Consummatum est. Ego cecidi."
Translated into English, it's over. I fell. A significant chunk of Cazador's power in Baldur's Gate comes from his ability to gather allies from other noble families who suffer from curses similar to vampirism, namely lycanthropy. The Hune family have a history with lycanthropy. In Murder in Baldur's Gate, one tongue-in-cheek phrase reads that the power of the Hunes waxes and wanes like the moon, and the lycanthropy has brought certain members into Szarr's orbit. Garrus Hune and Blaze Hune are Cazador's guards who are permitted to feast on guests at the end of the parties. The Hune family itself is as ancient as Baldur's Gate and has powerful connections throughout the Sword Coast, and in Tethir too, that intimidate any rival family into submission long before they think to act. They are the progenitors of the Knights of the Shield, a secret society the Emperor used to belong to and which centres around the Hidden Lord. For centuries, the Hunes have been guided by the shield of the Hidden Lord, a talking shield that claims it is in fact an imprisoned angel, but it's not. The Hidden Lord is no angel, but instead the spirit of Gargauth the Devil, a devil who sought to be worshipped like a god. But that's beside the point here. The point is that the Hunes are familiar with dark magic, some of which they know of via the lycanthropy and some of which they do not. Cazador provides a home for the Lycan Hunes, far away from the Hune mansion where other nobles might see them. This keeps the Hunes as tenuous allies while also having some formidable muscle to back him up in his territory. The Rillins are likewise affected by lycanthropy through Duva Rillin, another werewolf that you can find in the palace. The Rillins have their fingers/claws in every single bit of Baldur's Gate. Lord Heer Rillin, committee chair of the Committee of Concerned Patriarchs who are investigating Gortash, is just one example. The Rillins also run a successful and very profitable sword-wielding school that churns out generations of soldiers, mercenaries and thugs who remain loyal to the Rillins long after their graduation. According to Alder Ravengard, Ariax Rillin is a judge of some kind, and he often presides over the trials of alleged guild operatives and weighs the gavel to rule in their favour. Gothric Rillin can actually be dug up in the cemetery by Tav, having been buried there after stealing something from the Stone Lord. So the Rillins are invested in the Thieves Guild in one way or another, under the radar or not. Strange coincidence here, Henrietta Hune is due to marry Dirk Rillin in 1492, as her shafted lover from the Flaming Fist attests. Could Cazador have brokered this marriage, uniting two families affected by lycanthropy to consolidate his circle even more? I think so. The Szarr Palace is a kind of oubliette for the kin of these werewolf patriarchs. They are out of sight, out of mind, but their kin have the benefit of not feeling too much guilt, as they are at least alive and being taken care of somewhat by someone who understands their plight. Rillin and Hune are not quite staff in the Szarr Palace, they're more like house guests who double as a clean-up crew. Formal staff are headed up by Antoine de Fay, Chamberlain. Like Cazador, Antoine is a vampire, and yes, his name is a play on Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan. Now, here I am going to say that I would heartily encourage anyone to support the Satanic Temple and not the Church of Satan, as the Satanic Temple does far more good than the Church of Satan, which basically just posts memes online. For example, the Satanic Temple provide religious reproductive rights, as in Satanic practice, abortion is a religious ceremony, which means it's protected by law. I myself consider myself a Satanist and support the Satanic Temple. They don't worship Satan, they're a really solid, good organisation, and I'd encourage anyone to look them up further. Back to Antoine de Fay. He was trying to feign death using a potion provided by Dereth Bonecloak to escape his role in the ritual of profane ascension. His plan was to drink a potion or feign death and leave an acid poison nearby to make Cazador think that that's what he drank to commit suicide. But the idiot mixed up the potions and drank the acid poison instead of the fake poison. His werewolf girlfriend, Luciana Sauvage, found his dead body and drank the acid poison too in a Romeo and Juliet pastiche. Luriana lived in a secret pen behind de Fay's room, which I would expect to be more luxurious for the partner of the most powerful staff member of Cazador's retinue, but I guess not. There is the possibility that Dereth deliberately gave Antoine an incorrectly labelled potion out of fear that if Cazador ascended and found out Antoine had been provided a potion of feigned death, she would be killed in punishment for assisting Antoine in escaping his duty. Antoine, when he was alive, kept the palace and the staff in check. He orders around the charmed guards and the palace ramparts, he keeps the staff in line, and he does the mundane jobs that keep the castle running, like restocking on candles and blackout curtains. Baldur's Gate 3 doesn't show this, but Cazador does have a vampire warden in his service as well. Vampire wardens are more durable spawn that can shrug off blows that would fell anyone else, and act as formidable bodyguards. The vampire warden is seen here, right behind Cazador. Finally, there are Cazador's vampire spawn. They consist of Aurelia, once a tiefling, Cazador's firstborn. Her calm surface demeanour conceals countless secrets. Astarion and Cunin, once a elf magistrate, is Cazador's second spawn. Pale Petras, once a human, is Cazador's third spawn, and is known for his arrogance and stubbornness. Violet, once an elf, is Cazador's fourth spawn. She relishes tormenting her siblings and strives to please her master. Leon, once a human, was Cazador's most recent spawn. He is desperate to protect his young daughter Victoria from the evils of the palace. Yusen, who is small, was once a gnome. He hunts victims for Cazador. Deliria, once an elf and physician general to the Parliament of Baldur's Gate, seeks to reverse her vampirism through desperate medicinal measures. That list is taken directly from the Book of Hungers, so it is canon the order in which they were turned. For some reason, the last three, Yusen, Antoine and Deliria, aren't listed as spawn, and I wonder if that means they weren't sired by Cazador but serve him nonetheless. He remains able to compel them using woe either way. Violet is a childish, jealous and vindictive spawn. Her inferiority complex is mighty powerful, so she loathes her siblings most of the time. She's tried to assassinate Astarion by hiring a gang to off him in the Rat's Run tavern. She pranks her siblings, and she openly flirts with harvester devils when they appear at the palace. Something tells me she'd love Charlie XCX's brat. Deliria used to be physician general to the Parliament of Baldur's Gate. She's a snob and thinks she is above the lowly status of being a vampire spawn, and believes that she can cure vampirism by drinking a huge influx of young, pure blood to force a blood transfusion. She's wrong. The last spawn I know enough of to include here, excluding Astarion of course, are Leon Onufrio and his daughter Victoria. Leon was a sorcerer before being turned and was commanded to bring the unturned Victoria to the palace. Fearing the other vampires would feed off of his daughter, he put a counter curse on her so if she was killed, she'd act as a kind of necrotic bomb. He warned other spawn about drinking from Victoria. Deliria ignored him and paid the price. Victoria calls herself an orphan, and this confuses me. She claims that Deliria is the one who found her and brought her to the palace, promising her food and shelter. She doesn't mention Leon at all, even though Leon calls himself her father. Leon may be telling a white lie in that he's not her birth dad, but he has taken her under his wing and considers her his daughter. His protective instincts are so strong that Leon claims to be working with Figaro for a disguise for Victoria so she can escape the city, but this plan doesn't end up bearing fruit. This is also why Leon is doing his best to remain favoured spawn for as long as possible, because it means that he and Victoria can be in a separate bedroom away from the other dangerous vampire spawn. Victoria is also fixated on the number 17. It crops up in all of the warnings Leon gives her and the duties she has around the palace. Instead of the number itself being significant, I think this could reflect the counting compulsion of vampires, indicating that Victoria might be internalising their latent habits without quite realising it herself. Cazador tells Leon and Violet that he has a plan for Victoria, but we never find out how Victoria fits into this mysterious plan of his at all. Quick Marsupial on Reddit has the perfect explanation for this, so I'm just going to read what they said verbatim. If one of them attacks Victoria, Cazador wins because he gets to punish them. If they resist, he gets to enjoy torturing them by putting them right next to a helpless meal they can't eat, knowing he'll punish them. It's a win-win. if you're a crazy sadist. Of course, the Leon-Victoria link and Cazador's clear plan for Victoria might just be sloppy work on the part of Larian. This wouldn't be the first time either. The Sahagwyn necklace in my Unbelief video, Astarion mentioning the Szarr family, and other evidence means that I wouldn't be surprised if this was an oversight by Larian. Up in the attic, Incognita waits as she observes Cazador, who far, far below even the palace, in the tourmaline depths, makes his bedroom, sleeping amongst all the souls that are to grant him the power he can barely conceive of. And that is all about Cazador Szarr and his family and vampires in Baldur's Gate 3. If you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe and like it, and also consider joining my Patreon. For £5 a month you get early ad-free access to all of my videos, and there are tons of bonuses for joining at higher tiers as well. I am fully intending to come out with the video about Astarion and the other origin characters at some point, and I apologise if you heard rain in the background of this video because we had some crazy thunder when I was filming, which honestly is kind of fitting for a vampire video. And if you notice that I sounded a bit different in this video, it's because my false tooth has come out right here, there, which means I sound quite different in my head at least, so I hope you didn't hear it too much, and if you did, I'm sorry, I don't have the money to get the false tooth put back in, so it's going to stay like that for quite a while. Anyway, I'm now going to go and bury my face in my cats who have been curled up and very well behaved this entire time I've been filming, so I'll see you folks next time.